Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason, and welcome to everyone. I do want to say I'm really glad we were able to do this conference virtually this year, but I cannot wait until the next time that we all get together in person. I know it's coming. I feel it. I see it every day getting closer and closer. So thank you all for attending in this virtual world. I also wanted to mention that this conference has come together only because of the passion and the energy and the incredible collaboration of my amazing executive board, comprised of Jessie Goodwin, Esra Rowan, Lauren Rashford, and Jason Rupp. And I just want to thank you guys, first of all, so much for everything that you've contributed, all the sacrifices that you've made, all the time and energy. The result is really incredible. This executive board has also helped us to develop our mission statement for women at SLS. Our mission statement is that we provide women with an infrastructure to achieve equity as decision makers in the life sciences industry. Today is just one way that we're generating the support for women toward that goal. And I also wanted to just echo quickly the comments Jason made, thanking our sponsors. This could not have happened without you. And I also want to echo what Jason mentioned earlier. Our panelists are truly incredible. The Southeast Color event this morning was wonderful, but the panelists that we've pulled together for this afternoon are sure to wow you. So I'm really excited about today. I also wanted to make one last thank you before we get started. This one is actually for Tiffany Wilson, who I'm not sure if she's on the line or not. She's now the CEO at the Science Center in Philadelphia, but she was one of the founding members of Southeast. It used to be MedTech Women at SEMDA, but now Women at SLS. Thank you, Tiffany. This was your brainchild to start with, and none of us would be here today if it weren't for her vision. So as I was getting prepared for today and thinking about, getting ready for this conference, all the late hours and the texts and the emails and the chaos flying, I thought many times about, why am I doing this? And, the reality is that diversity in the healthcare world, it just carries a whole lot of benefits. First of all, it's really good for our companies. There's been data and evidence to suggest that companies with a lot of diversity enjoy better problem solving. They have higher employee retention. It's easier for them to recruit. And also they see higher individual motivation among their employees. But also importantly, companies with a lot of diversity actually get better results. In fact, there was a study by McKinsey, and the study was entitled Why Diversity Matters. And they found that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform non-gender diverse companies. And interestingly, ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform companies with minimal diversity. So in our opening keynote today with Deanne Kasim, you'll hear more about how women can continue to lead out to make that the case. But it's also good for society. It ensures that equity is perpetuated for female professionals and entrepreneurs. Women account for over 50% of the US population, just barely, but for 47% of the country's labor force. But only 20% of executives, senior officers, and minority and managers in US high-tech industries are women. And the numbers are even worse when it comes to minorities. We really need to elevate the role of women in our industry. It's also, importantly, very good for patients. It's been shown that diversity in healthcare results in better care for diverse populations. A healthcare staff should be as diverse, if not more diverse, than the patient base that they're treating. And that helps ensure that no matter who walks through the door, there's someone on the staff who can identify with them, communicate with them, and serve their individual needs. As we speak, my mother is having a pacemaker implanted. And so that's particularly important to me today. All right, you'll hear a little bit today also about, in our closing keynote, about one other women's health issue, which is breast cancer. We've got to continue to reinforce the work underway to make sure that women's healthcare issues are given adequate attention. And finally, I want to mention, today you'll hear from one of our panels about how to better collaborate with healthcare facilities inside and outside of the Southeast to achieve fast and efficient and meaningful collaborations in healthcare. So as you know, much of our base is comprised of early stage companies. And I found it fascinating when I read that a 2017 Harvard Business Review article indicated that male and female entrepreneurs get asked different questions by venture capital. And furthermore, it affects how much funding that they get. So you'll hear today from panelists about getting women more board ready so we can help elevate the game of our large and small Southeast life science companies at an even more impactful level. And one of the main missions that we have as an executive board is to get women more adequately represented in those decision-making roles, as you heard earlier. So I hope that you'll take a lot away from this conference today. I'm confident that you will. But I also hope that it'll inspire you to get engaged with women at SLS. We're building something really important for all of us here. And the more groundswell of engagement that we have from women in the industry, the better we'll be able to achieve these very lofty goals. So with that, I want to introduce our opening keynote. So, this past year has challenged healthcare leaders, but it's also highlighted what defines good leadership in chaotic and changing times. This pandemic put a spotlight not only on the many areas where the healthcare industry needs to improve, but also on the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the many facets of the industry, including leadership at every level. So I'd like to introduce Deanne Kasim, an executive leader in health technology, policy, strategy, and market analytics. And thank Lauren Rashford as well for introducing us. So please welcome Deanne for an opening keynote on the topic of rising to the occasion, growing leadership skills, nurturing networks, and breaking barriers. Lauren and Deanne, welcome.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks, Lauren. Jason, I was wondering if we could go ahead and load the slides up.
Yes, you want me to share?
If you can, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure can.
Thanks. While Jason's getting the slides up, it is a pleasure to be here with you all virtually. I wish we were in person, but I understand we are getting there sooner rather than later, which is very exciting. I just want to level set a little bit about my background. I've been working in healthcare my entire career, mostly on the IT, but also on policy and strategy across multiple stakeholder groups. I actually am in Montgomery County, Maryland, Gaithersburg to be exact, where 2 miles from my house is Novavax's new headquarters, and about 1.5 miles from my house, AstraZeneca has a huge campus. About 4 or 5 miles away is the National Cancer Institute, and Johns Hopkins University has a satellite campus. So if you think about it, I am surrounded by bio and pharma and digital therapeutics. So I am very excited to be here with this group. Thanks for loading the slides, Jason. Well, I think, they always say pictures are worth 1,000 words. And I think I found this picture because I just thought, all of us have come out of 2020 and into 2021 with a lot of things that we've experienced. Loss, heartache, challenges. Some of us had more challenges and loss than others. But I feel like we have a lot of lessons learned that we can look back on, talk about, and figure out how do we build better moving forward, whether it's talking about our healthcare system, whether it's talking about our own organizations, and definitely when we're talking about women's leadership in the industry. As was mentioned, Allison mentioned in the introduction, this whole pandemic experience has shown a light on what's not working well in the healthcare system, what wasn't working well and was underfunded, quite honestly, in the public healthcare system. And also, it's a known fact that women have had more burdens during the entire pandemic experience, whether it was working from home and homeschooling kids, taking on more teaching responsibilities, childcare duties. And that is particularly evident when we look at women that perhaps are single mothers and communities of color. And all of this has brought up all these problems to the surface, and it's, what do we do with it now? I've spent a lot of time last year in virtual meetings with congressional staff talking about how do we fund and put standards in place to get public health where it needs to be moving forward? How do we as healthcare companies take the lead on looking at how do we fix what's in the healthcare system to be more effective? And one of that, quite honestly, is staffing. How do we look at staffing our healthcare providers? There's going to be a ton of burnout as a result of this pandemic that they're already talking about. And unfortunately, it is also disproportionately impacting women more than men. That said, that's a lot of problems. I just threw out there. So how do we really rethink the future of work and the future of healthcare? I can tell you that at the federal level, which is a lot of my day job, they're definitely looking at how to improve public health IT, public health supply chain, and not just through throwing money at it, but putting conditions around local grants. And that would include enticing states to work better with each other about how do we have licenses that work across state lines, not just during the public health emergency, but moving forward. When we look at the return to work, what does that look like? I'm sure each and every organization on here has probably had those conversations. Working for a large public company, we have been having those conversations since last summer. And I will go through in the next couple of slides and just kind of talk about some of the many dynamics that we're considering, not only to be a successful and better organization, but also to support our customers, where at Change Healthcare, we sit uniquely between patients, providers, and payers, and we touch all of those groups, in addition to some of the ancillary groups like labs and pharma and research now. Lastly, I will say that we look at work and the future of work and moving into the new normal. I would say that your definition of success, whether that be your career success or your personal success, we can't have that definition without including the concept of well-being in it. Okay, I really hope that we take that as leaders, whether you're whatever gender you identify with, and really put the idea that well-being needs to be part of how we define and measure success. Next slide. We touched on this in the opening, Allison's great opening introduction to the session, but this is something that I know I've heard being talked about for many years in corporate leadership, corporate governance circles, but it's now actually getting, in my opinion, some legs because investors are caring about it. Whenever you have the folks that control the purse strings getting focused on something, it usually happens sooner rather than later. And so again, for public and even some non-public companies, the idea of ESG, environmental, social, and governance disclosures. This is a big thing right now that I'm hearing on Capitol Hill. They want to know how companies are impacting the environment and what they intend to do about it if there's whatever that negative impact might be. In my opinion, I think a lot of healthcare is getting kind of a hall pass on that conversation right now, simply because they realize the pandemic has really impacted so many providers and so many payers. But I do think it's coming for healthcare, particularly providers. They're not going to get off the hook on this. Social, what are you doing in your environment, in your community? How are you impacting your community? How are you giving back? How are you looking at what you're doing in terms of charitable contributions and really making the world a better place? And governance. And that speaks to not only code of conduct, which at Change Healthcare, we are all required every year to take a 2-hour code of conduct exam. For good, better, or worse. But then again, our compliance program has won multiple awards. So we've got that going for us. Looking at executive pay, as well as all important diversity. And I can tell you from a public company standpoint, the last 3 years that I've been here and privy to what's going on at the senior leadership level, this is becoming more of a thing. It's becoming a really important thing. Our board and our shareholders have realized, and our management, that equity inclusion is what is going to make us a better company and better serve our customers. And I can tell you in Health IT, I've heard Mickey Tripathi, who is our national coordinator for Health IT. I don't know if this is on a t-shirt yet, but he certainly has coined this phrase, equity by design. equity in everything that the government is looking at for public health and even health IT. And I would encourage you to think about that in some of your inventions and innovations. How do we have equity by design? How do we have tequity, which is another term that I've heard. Another thing is DE&I. This is really growing fast. I've seen even some of my colleagues get elevated in opportunities with other companies to be chief DE&I officers. And how do we really focus on that and walk the walk and not just talk the talk? And I'm happy to throw out, in fact, I'm proud to throw out some examples that Change Healthcare has done, where we started creating a few summers ago the idea of business resource groups. And I'm proud to say that the first resource group we created was women. And it's not just something that lives on our company intranet. It is actually trying to network. We have speakers from time to time to not only foster that internal connection, but bring fresh ideas from outside. And since then, we have expanded those resource groups. We have Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinx or Latinos. We have veterans. We have one for the disabled, which we call small DIS with a capital A, ability group. And we also have a pride group. And so look, oh, we also have young professionals. I think that's all of them. Yes. So the idea is, yeah, we can talk about diversity and equity, but we set up these resource groups as a foundation. We also are having our board hold us accountable. We looked across the organization and we realized that in technical positions, sales, management in particular, it is very heavily male. And we now have a requirement for every open position, particularly in those areas, but any open position in the company, you must look at a certain number of resumes to meet these DE&I goals. And we're going to blind the resumes. You're not going to see the name. You're not going to see any demographic about them. You're just going to look at the experience before we move on past the initial screening. Lastly, I want to share something that happened as a result of the social unrest and everything that happened last year, whether it was the George Floyd incident and all the aftermath after that. We started something in the company calling it Conversations That Matter. We realized there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of things that needed to be talked about in the organization. And I'm proud of what our leaders, particularly in HR, did. And we had an impromptu town hall led by our CEO, but also we took volunteers of African-American leaders and also not necessarily people in the upper management level that wanted to volunteer and talk about what they were thinking, how they were feeling, and what this meant to their everyday life. I can tell you that it was a raw conversation. It was something I've never experienced before in any work environment, and we are continuing that conversation. Even to this day, we're having those quarterly conversations where we're talking about, are we making progress as a company? How are people thinking about this? Where can we do better? And that's just a start. And I share that with you as just food for thought. When you look at your own organizations, I realize not everybody is a large public company, which sometimes can give you a lot more agile capabilities and just doing things quicker and faster. But I would encourage you to think about maybe some of these things and how they might fit within your environment, within your leadership style. Next slide. While I'm waiting for the next slide, Jason, are you still there?
I am here and I'm having, it's not, like nothing is happening on my end.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the share and then reshare.
Okay, thank you. Technology is great when it works. As we've all experienced this last year, I'm sure. Thank you. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the importance of mentorship, what mentorship looks like versus what championship looks like. Next slide, Jason. Thank you. A mentorship, in my opinion, is something we've always talked about in the industry. I've heard it talked about. It's so important to have a mentor. And then yet, where do I find one? Is there an official mentorship list? How do I get on that? How do I become a mentor? And I look at this as a couple things. Number one, it used to be something that was nice to have. I now think if we're really going to walk the walk on diversity, equity, inclusion, this has to be an essential part of it. We can't just leave it to chance or say, yeah, we have a mentorship program. And I've seen in many organizations where organizations have tried to stand something up and it just doesn't work. Either because internally folks feel like there's so much on their plate they can't possibly take one more thing on, or there's a set of criteria and a formalization of it that happens that it can either intimidate would-be mentors or intimidate would-be mentees. There's many different ways of having a mentorship relationship, and it's not one size fits all. It can be short-term, it can be medium-term, it can be long-term, it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be a group. You can mentor a whole bunch of people at the same time in a group setting. It can happen up and down in an organization. I have had to, quite honestly, mentor my boss about government affairs, and I'm happy to do that because he has mentored me about a lot of other things just having to do with senior leadership. So I think it's important to know that not all things are going to happen for all people, but let's start the conversation. And I'll get into in some subsequent slides some of the resources that I have found for mentorship that are actual external programs that are trying to promote this. But I do think that for senior leaders, nobody got here by yourself. Somebody's at some point took the time to teach you something, to introduce you to someone, to share a pearl or pearls of wisdom. You don't own your whole experience just by you. Like no man is an island, no woman is an island, right? So I think it's important not only to think about giving back, and that's where I say sending the elevator back down. And so, think about that. How can you find other younger people? And to the younger people, how do you find someone that's experienced? It used to be in-person conferences for me were the way to do it. Well, the last 15 months, it's virtual. And I'll talk about some of the ways you can form some of those relationships in a little bit. So what's the difference between mentor and champions? Well, champions are the people that really go above and beyond. They invite you to opportunities. They don't just talk to you and share wisdom. They're actually bringing you in. They're putting your name into consideration for new and more senior roles. They're opening doors for you. I have been blessed in my life to have a number of champions, and one is actually a current C-suite person at my company. I am eternally grateful to these people because they've not only taken the time to share what they've learned and give me helpful advice, but they've made things happen for me. And if you're lucky, you'll have a champion in your career, or you'll be a champion, or both. But I just wanted to also point out that I did some research on this, asking a lot of senior advisors, senior women I have relationships with in the last 2 months, because I knew I was going to be doing this talk. And I thought, well, I don't want it just to be my experience. I want to share other people's experience. And one of the research notes I came upon was, men have evolved into natural champions. And I feel like men have more opportunities for that, whether it's traditionally being on the golf course together, going fishing, doing ball games, doing things where they are able to really have that relationship and, suggest your buddy for something. Well, women have become aces at mentoring. And my challenge to everyone is, how do we get not only cross-pollination, because no one said that your mentor or champion has to be the same gender as you, but how do we cross-pollinate those conversations between men and women? And I think it's also a matter of getting everyone to realize, once again, coming back to the ESG and DE&I goals, it's not only something that the money is looking for, but it's how do you make a better company, which is what Allison pointed out in the introduction. So how do we make those connections, especially in this hybrid, I'm sick of Zoom, but I'm still here for a while kind of world? Next slide, please, Jason. I talked to an organization 3 years ago in an in-person keynote, and it was on the back end of the Me Too moment. And it's a health IT organization that is primarily made up of baby boomers, and I'd say 75% men, 25% women. And kudos to them for realizing that if you don't do something to foster better, like more diversity and younger members here, you really run the risk of aging out. You're going to have most of your leaders here retire, and then what happens? Then your membership's going to shrink, and we start looking about financial crises for the organization. So they asked me to talk about networking, and I shared with them the importance of LinkedIn. and the importance of, I can tell you that recruiters, because I have recruited and hired people in the last 8 months, the recruiters in our company start out by looking at LinkedIn. When I referred somebody for a senior management position at my organization, my CEO wanted to see their LinkedIn profile. It's used not only for recruiters, but I use it a lot to make online connections that I hope will eventually develop into in-person relationships, particularly over the last 15 months when you really couldn't meet with people, either because of geography or you just didn't feel safe having a cup of coffee next to them. So I would encourage you to look at LinkedIn and how to use it more of a tool. I know LinkedIn itself has more tutorials, and there's always ways to brush up your LinkedIn profile. I've actually had to go use outside help because for me personally, one of the hardest things for me to do is to write my own stuff about myself. I'd rather almost have a needle in the eye, but that's just me. Maybe that applies to some of you, I don't know. But I would, recommend that if for no other reason, recruiters are looking at it. But it's also a way to really establish connections. And I also monitor my connections, what they're saying on LinkedIn. I've actually learned a lot of industry news looking at other people's LinkedIn posts. I don't mean do it all day, but it's there as a resource. Same thing with Twitter. I have been following certain threads. So in my world in health IT, there are weekly meetups of healthcare leaders is one, hashtag HCLR or HCLDER. There's another one, Health IT Marketing, HITMC, Marketing Communications. They have weekly tweet ups. And while I may not be an active participant, I follow their threads. I also have policy colleagues on Twitter who post a lot of late breaking news that I might miss or not see till the next day. So I must check Twitter a few times a day just to see what's going on. And I've actually established some relationships with folks on Twitter. And we met up in conferences and it was just, oh, you look so different. So anyway, always update your headshot too. That's my personal ask, because when you go meet people in person, it's really not helpful if you see their college-aged headshot, And then this weird environment of in-person and hybrid meetings. Where do we go from here? Well, to be continued, but we will be meeting in person. And I would say this: don't throw away your business cards. Early on in my career, I was attending a networking 101 session for younger professionals, not just healthcare, and it was taught by a very seasoned business development person. And the things that she taught me was not only always be networking. You never know when the person behind you in the grocery store will be someone that you just happen to want to know because they're in your industry. I'm here in the fourth largest bio region of the country. There's always a bio person around here, or pharma or digital therapeutics, but also that men tend to collect business cards, is what she said. They're gatherers. It's almost like I got more business cards out of this meeting than you. And women tend to foster relationships. I throw that out there just to think about that. Does that apply to you? I don't know, but I found that in my line of work, I definitely have had more male sales reps that I've worked with than others, and they seem to be very interested in collecting names, whereas I really wanted to get to know people. So throwing that out there just as a difference between how men and women might work, something to think about. So I did this talk with this health IT group 3 years ago, and I thought it was interesting because at the reception later, this older person came up to me and asked me how many LinkedIn contacts I had. And I said, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's more than 2,000. So he said to me, you actually eat your own dog food. I didn't know how to take that. I'll take it for dog food. But I don't think I'm wrong on using technology to make connections, to not only help yourself learn about the industry, but if you're a growing company and you're looking to hire people, no better source than the people you actually know in person. Next slide, please. Another thing that I found.
It's happening again.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna just keep going.
Okay.
So my next slide is talking about personal branding. And again, this is something that's really hard for me personally, and I find working with an external consultant who actually does that for a living is helpful. But when I talk about personal branding, I did recently go through a board training program last year. And one of the things they say you need to start with is your elevator pitch. how do you describe yourself? And I just thought, wow, you know, I'm not at 30 seconds yet. And why do I need an elevator pitch anyway? Well, regardless of whether or not you want board opportunities, if that's in something you're looking at, everyone needs a personal brand. It helps not only with networking, but it's going to get you to your next level. You have to really take everything that you do, what you're good at, your experience, your expertise, your competencies, what have you achieved, and what's your common thread. So I have to say, this was a painful experience for me just because it's hard, but hopefully it's a lot easier for some of you if you try this, or maybe you already have your personal brand statement, which is awesome. But how do you market yourself as an award-winning product? And when I think about, I have marketing in my background, but you know, I could market, and I have marketed, quite honestly, stuff that didn't work very well. Stuff that was later found out to be kind of vaporware because it was really the beta version. And that was fine. I could talk about that all day, but for me to talk about what my brand was, what my slogan is, that was some real soul searching. And so one of the things that I found helpful is to talk to other colleagues, get other people's opinions of yourself. That was profoundly helpful for me, to go to some friendly colleagues and say, you know, what do you think of me? What it is, what do you think I specialize in? What's my strength? And I can tell you that when I asked this question of colleagues, they said, well, I'm a connector. I introduce people and make relationships happen. Or I make this is a conversation I had yesterday. I'm a professional unicorn builder. I go to startup companies, startup health IT companies that are innovating, and I help them grow and achieve that status. So these are just examples of what people's personal branding statement looks like. But I do think this is key for everybody, regardless of what level you are in your career right now, to always think about your personal brand and what your elevator speech is, and use that as the foundation to build your resume, to build your bio, to build your board bio. And I know there's a board session coming up, so I don't want to steal their thunder. Next slide. So one thing I want to talk about is authentic leadership. We've spent a lot of time in my employer talking about this because I think everybody had some opportunity to do a lot more thinking this last year. Think about, how do we keep morale up? How do we lead through this chaotic, changing, unknown type of environment? And with something that we've spent a lot of time talking about. And, you know, one of the things that we've talked about is empathy. I was a little taken aback that there was some managers that I work with that really didn't understand what it meant to be an empathic leader, but that just shows that this is something that's perhaps new, that we haven't talked about this traditionally in leadership. You know, how to be aware of yourself, what your strengths, what your weaknesses are, how your team perceives you, but also how is your team doing? Really having those honest conversations, even on the days when you really don't want to. And believe me, there's been plenty of days in the last year, if I had to do one more video call, I didn't care who it was with. But, you know, empathy just being one of those things that's so important. Looking for conscious and unconscious bias training. We are now mandating all the people leaders in our company attend conscious and unconscious bias training with an outside party, not just something you read on a deck of slides. And I found it to be very enlightening, very helpful. A few things I just want to leave with you as nuggets on this one is, you know, change happens when you're uncomfortable. I have to admit, I got a Peloton last year, and that's something I kept hearing the Peloton instructors say as I was sweating my butt off and thinking I was going to die. It's true. You don't get any better until you get out of your comfort zone. And lastly, I wanted to share on this one of my favorite quotes from a book that I've read recently, and it's by Abby Wambach. Leader is not a title the world gives to you. It is an offering you give to the world. And I think if more organizations would really think about this, you know, what is it that makes a good leader, rather than here, have a promotion, here's a new title, you know, how do we really live that? How do we put that into our daily behaviors? Just something to chew on there. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to share with you some resources that I have found really helpful, that colleagues of mine have found helpful, and they might be helpful to you. The first is one near and dear to my heart. It's Women Business Leaders in Healthcare, but they go by the acronym WBL. And that is for senior level executives of all healthcare stakeholder groups, whether it's biopharma, health IT, healthcare, health insurance, health law. It was actually started by a health lawyer who realized that as she was moving into board positions and leadership positions, that she was there alone. And she wanted to make an organization that could offer networking and friendships and also have external resources in the form of informal and formal programs to really grow leadership skills and grow connections. Another one that I've heard some of my colleagues join is CHIEF, and this is not healthcare specific. This is a group specifically for senior women execs who have goals of trying to get to the C-suite, developing your networks, developing professional education resources. Another one is Athena Alliance. This is something that was suggested by my mentor at Change Healthcare. And this is, again, for senior women execs who are interested in board service and networking. There's 2 different levels of membership with them. One gives you more access to outside advisors than the other. Lastly, I have actually been a mentee in the C-Sweetener program. If you are familiar with the Future of Healthcare Conference, which goes by the HLTH, and the website's hlth.co. Their conference is coming up in October. They started with the backing of their investors. They call it C-Sweetener. And the idea is to get more women into positions of leadership, eventually to the C level. They have a long list of mentors of all different stakeholder groups. And I found it, just as a mentee, a great opportunity to make connections. It's not necessarily that they're teaching me some things that I don't know, but it's great to make connections. They've shared with me some pearls, if you will. I've shared with them some pearls. But these are things that if you're interested or your staff are interested, I would recommend sharing this information. Next slide. And since it's summer, and hopefully you get a chance to do something enjoyable, which may or may not involve reading a book on a beach somewhere, I don't know. These are books that I have recently dove into, like The Confidence Code and Think Again, or others that I am getting into. One that my mentor sent to me that specifically addresses bio and therapeutics is The Code Breaker. But I just thought I'd share since it's summer, and I know last year I binged watched way too much stuff on Netflix. I need to actually do something a little bit more intellectual this year. Next slide. So for closing thoughts, the opportunities are increasing for us, despite the fact that it's still not parity. It's still very much, a male-dominated industry. And I hope that we can keep the foot on the gas. I hope that we can keep looking at challenging traditional stereotypes, biases, whatever that glass ceiling may or may not look like for you. Everything that's happened in the last year has brought us to a place where I feel like this is really the momentum between the pandemic, social unrest and justice, a focus on equity, a focus on diversity. If it's ever going to happen, I believe it's now. And look to build a community of allies, formal and informal mentors, authentic leaders. We owe it to not only build this now for ourselves and our organizations, but for the future generation of leaders. And also to remember, there's not one career path to get there. Traditionally, I think when I look at my parents' generation, there was like a one line. You just kept working up your way up the ladder and you went in a line. Now I think a career path is really a squiggly line. Looks like, something I would draw, I'm right-handed, something I would draw with my left hand, that kind of thing. Your career may take you in different places, but the end goal is the same: to have a career that inspires you, that challenges you, that you want to keep doing, and that you want to keep creating. And I think in this area of healthcare, it's never been more important, right? We've never seen how important investments in research and therapeutics and fixing our delivery system and fixing our finance system and fixing our public health. So really, I truly believe the time is now. And with that, in the next slide, we'll offer you my contact information and would love to have some questions and hopefully we'll have some answers and discussion. So thank you.
Great. Any questions from the audience, or let's see. We do have a couple chat.
Well, perhaps instead of questions, if there's any pearls that anyone else would love to share, something that worked for them or something that you're dealing with right now that you think is either a challenge or an opportunity.
So actually, I did have a question. I was just trying to find the right slide. On mentors and champions, and I know you covered this a little bit, so apologize if you're going to, go over the same topic, but can you go into a little bit more about finding these types of people, particularly champions? And that's harder.
Mhm.
Mentors, there's lots of people that are professional mentors that you can find, or coaches. But champions is a different, because that's somewhat somebody that is already doing that kind of thing. It's difficult to come up and say, hey, will you be my champion, and invite me to do things and things like that. So go in a little more detail there.
Sure, absolutely. Every champion that I've ever been blessed to have a relationship with was a relationship that was fostered over time. In a few of those cases, they were actually people that were my boss or my boss's peer at that level. But I think why I wanted to spend some time talking about networking and developing your networks is it really is a relationship that you cultivate. That person has to know you. And I will say that some people are better at this than others. There are some people that are just natural born connectors. They want to connect people to other people. They want to put 2 and 2 together and hopefully get 5 or 6 out of it. Actually, the conversation I had yesterday, which is a woman I met through the C-Sweetener program, right off the bat, how can I help you? Which there are people out there that's like that. And there, it's just developing your relationships and finding who do you think you click with, and they're willing to go to bat for you. And not everybody is like that. But if you develop your network and spend time with those relationships, hopefully you find one.
Thank you.
Hey, Jason, I actually also have a question for Deanne,
Okay.
if you don't mind. That was a great talk. First of all, I'm particularly passionate about developing mentors for people. I actually just started a mentoring program within my own company this past year, along with our Professional Women's Alliance. And I think that's really important. But I want to ask you for your advice about just a kind of a touchy topic.
Mm-hmm.
So can you help us to any suggestions or ideas about how we as women can walk that fine line of starting and having uncomfortable conversations when we need to about equity, while not damaging relationships with either the leaders or investors, perhaps, where we're seeing those inequities come to life? I mean, I think, at least for me, I'll speak from my own personal experience. It's really hard to do that well in the moment. You think
Mm-hmm.
about all the things you wish you had said or done later, but in that moment, it's actually really hard. So I just wondered if you had any tips or tricks or suggestions or any ways that you've seen that done well that doesn't come off as offensive or insulting to the people that you need to, I don't want to say call out, but at least have acknowledged the issue.
Sure. That's a great conversation or question, I should say. And what I've seen in organizations is, I've seen this where it is a male-dominated leadership committee, right? And everyone knows it. And unfortunately, they were sometimes forced to have that conversation because of stuff that appeared on social media or Glassdoor.com, or there's a whole bunch of other job board type things out there where then our external comms people are finding this and saying, this is an issue. That is one example. And in my mind, that's like how a company, you don't want to do things, right? You don't want to have to read about yourself in the dirty laundry sections of public websites and then be like, oh, all right. But in conversations that I've been a part of, it's a fine line. You're absolutely right. And I think that, first of all, it depends on who you're talking to and how they may view the conversation. If you are a company that has a lot of investors in it, perhaps this is an easier conversation to talk about DE&I goals because it matters to investors more and more now. But I think looking at the research that's out there. And sometimes I found that if you come armed with facts, but also really morale too. I mean, if this is all touchy-feely to me in that you've got things that are intangible, like morale, how do you define morale other than sending out a survey monkey and getting people's temperature? But also you've got hard facts on research. McKinsey is one of the great sources out there. Everybody knows McKinsey, right? That has put some diversity and productivity and correlated those two things together and said, you know, more diverse company are more productive and it matters to the bottom line. And really kind of make your case without being accusatory, without cornering people. But I do think that depending on the situation, this is sometimes a longer term conversation. But my hope is that as this gets talked about more and more, I mean, it's easy to just kind of give it some lip service and then go on with other projects or putting out other fires within an organization. But my hope is the more this gets talked about externally, the more we sort of showcase companies that are really having more diversity and their productivity and what that really means to the bottom line as well as a culture, that this will be easier conversations to have. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll throw in one other thing that I think is really interesting. I'm reading a book right now called Thanks for the Feedback. I'm sure many of you have read it. And I found one particular part really interesting, and I'm wondering maybe I can use this point in those conversations, in those difficult moments. But when people are judging themselves, they reflect on their intentions, right? So they judge themselves based on their intentions. But when people are judging other people, they judge them based on the results. And so that's one way I think that you can have those uncomfortable conversations with people, is just to say, you know, you might know or assume or even just state that it's possible that they had the intention of one thing, but perhaps the result was that it came out differently. And I haven't tried it yet, but I'm wondering that might be a way for us to be able to approach these delicate conversations. I'll let you know next year how that went.
That's a really good point. Valerie, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to make mention of one of your slides on champions versus mentors. And this comes up repeatedly with women in every board group that I'm a member of. And I actually am an ambassador for a group of life science CEOs that are all women. And many of them are interested in being on boards. But we talk constantly about champions and mentors. And this is something that I walked away with. A mentor is someone who speaks for you when they're with you, right? They help you. A champion is someone who speaks for you when you are not there. And that's very important. So a boss or another person in the organization that, you know, says, hey, you know, Allison would be terrific for our next vice president of sales. We ought to think about it because here's her competencies that I've seen. So that's a true champion. And so building those champions takes time, and it's often easier to build champions versus mentors if you spend a little bit of time with them. And I had a male come to me recently and said to me, you know, how do I make a champion in my company? And I said, well, you happen to be speaking at a retreat and conference that I'm part of. Who have you gone to? Who are the people in your company that you would like to impress or build a relationship with, or let them get to know you a little bit? And he listed 3 people, and I said, go to those 3 people, ask them for their input on a conference subject that you're doing. Sit down with them and have a cup of coffee, and you've now built a relationship and continue to foster that relationship. So he said, I never thought of that. I said, you build a champion that way. And so he was thrilled. That's exactly, it takes time, but it's relationship building, right? And then I just wanted to say one other thing about branding. I think the personal branding piece is critical. I have a difficult time doing that. You really have to work at it, but I have to give accolades to someone who I have gotten to know through their personal branding on LinkedIn, who's on this call. Dr. Jane Morgan is an amazing personal brander. If you have not seen through COVID what she's been doing, not only her pictures, her recent pictures, of course, with the vice president and the senators, et cetera, but her stairwell chronicles, where she every day posted on things during COVID on a stairway, always looking beautiful, of course. but also then she started doing it in Spanish, and I'm Latina, and it totally reached out to me. And I went, wow. So personal branding, whether you know it impacts you or not, it does impact your image. And she's like, to me, the goddess of personal branding. So personal branding is really important, and people do notice. It's hard to do. You really have to work at it. But that's just 2 things that you mentioned that I think are so critical.
Great. Thank you for that additional commentary. That's great.
All right. Well, we have about 3 minutes. Deanne, any final words of wisdom? Your presentation was phenomenal.
Well, thanks, Jason. I've just been so happy to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could see everyone's faces in person, but I'm excited about your fall event that's coming up, which will be in person later this year. That should be a great event, and I hope you have a really good time and success with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we're all looking forward to it, I think. Ready to get out.